The air in the lecture hall was thick with tension. It wasn't just the calculus equations scrawled across the board or the oppressive quiet that had settled over the 200 students in the room. It was something else, something palpable. Dr. Adrian. Harper stood at the front, his sharp features cast in the stark fluorescent lights, and his eyes narrowed behind his thick glasses as he surveyed the room. His reputation as a man who demanded perfection was legendary. The students had heard. The rumors, those who failed to meet his impossible standards, would be publicly humiliated. He was a stickler for detail, and if you didn't meet his high bar, you'd quickly learn just how little patience he had for underperforming students. But there was one student in the class, one who'd flown under the radar for months. His name was Lucas Cruz, a quiet Filipino student who always sat in the back corner. Most of the students didn't even notice him, too wrapped up in their own struggles with the material. Lucas didn't engage in the social dynamics that colored the lives of his peers. He wasn't the loud, attention-grabbing type. Instead, he quietly scribbled equations in his notebook, his eyes constantly scanning the numbers like they were pieces of a puzzle that only he could see, and today that puzzle was about to be solved in a way no one had anticipated. "All right," Dr. Harper's voice sliced through the silence, sharp as a blade. "We're going to tackle something advanced today, a challenge for those of you who think you're ready for the real world." His gaze swept across the classroom, landing on several students who looked like they were barely hanging on. His eyes lingered a moment longer on Lucas, who was sitting there, his hands resting calmly on his notebook. "There's a mistake here in the second line of the equation I've written. I'd like to see if anyone can spot it. This will be your final chance to prove your worth." The challenge was clear. Harper didn't just expect answers, he demanded brilliance, a level of insight that could silence even the most seasoned students. His voice dripped with disdain as he glanced over at Lucas, who was still staring at his notebook, unmoved by the spectacle unfolding around him. Dr. Harper took a deep breath and turned to the board, his marker gliding across the white surface with deliberate precision. The problem he had written was beyond the scope of what any normal student could handle. It involved complex integrals, derivatives, and an advanced series of steps that, when done wrong, could throw off the entire solution. As the chalk hit the board, Lucas's gaze lifted, scanning the numbers and variables. His mind, always calculating, immediately saw something off. He didn't hesitate, but he remained silent. "Anyone?" Dr. Harper pressed, his voice rising. "If you can't solve it, don't bother pretending. You'll only embarrass yourself. I don't tolerate mediocrity in this classroom." The students shifted uneasily. They knew what this meant. This wasn't just about math, it was about power. Dr. Harper was testing their will as much as their intellect. No one dared challenge him, except Lucas did. His hand rose slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to be seen. The room went quiet as his peers glanced at him, some with confusion, others with disbelief. A few of the more vocal students snickered under their breath, as if to say, "What does he think he's doing?" But the moment Lucas stood up, every eye in the room was fixed on him. Dr. Harper's eyes flashed with surprise. He hadn't expected anyone, especially not him, to challenge him. The silence stretched, tense and uncomfortable. Lucas walked to the front of the room, his movements steady, his face calm. Dr. Harper smirked, almost amused, as he turned to face the class. "Well then, Mr. Cruz, let's see what you've got. Show us what you can do with this mess." His voice was laced with condescension, a challenge that was meant to put Lucas in his place. But Lucas didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the provocation. Instead, he walked to the board, took the chalk from Dr. Harper's hand, and began his work. He didn't hurry. His fingers moved with quiet assurance, his mind working 1,000 steps ahead. He carefully erased the first mistake, then the second, and began reconstructing the solution from the ground up. The students watched, their skepticism giving way to confusion. What was happening? This was advanced calculus, far beyond anything They had learned so far in the semester, even the most gifted students would have struggled to follow the logic of Lucas's movements. Dr. Harper's face froze as he realized the implications. He had made a mistake, a big one, but he wasn't about to let anyone know that. He stood there, watching as Lucas worked with an ease that made the problem seem almost trivial. It was like watching a pianist play a complicated symphony without breaking a sweat. Every stroke of chalk, every number placed on the board felt effortless, almost as if Lucas had done this 1,000 times before. The room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. The equation, which had seemed so impossible moments ago, was being unraveled piece by piece by a student who hadn't said a word all semester. And with every second, the stakes grew higher. Would Dr. Harper let this go, or would he escalate the challenge? Would Lucas prove to everyone that he was far more than just a quiet student in the back of the room? Dr. Harper stood still, his gaze locked on Lucas's every move. The tension between them was palpable, and the students could feel it, like the calm before a storm, waiting for the explosion that was sure to follow. The lecture hall at Princeton University was a grand, imposing structure, with its tall windows that allowed streams of sunlight to filter in and illuminate the rows of eager students. It could have been a serene place for learning. But today, like every other, the atmosphere inside was charged with an unspoken pressure. The heavy scent of textbooks and chalk hung in the air, but it was the weight of expectation that was the real burden. At the front of the room stood Dr. Michael Roberts, a man whose reputation as a brilliant mathematician was as well known as his rigid, unforgiving attitude. His cold blue eyes scanned the room, his expression stern and devoid of any hint of warmth. To him, teaching wasn't about inspiring students. It was about testing their limits, seeing who could survive under pressure. He was known for tearing down those who weren't up to his standards, and for a select few, that meant ridicule. Class, today we will be exploring the intricacies of multivariable calculus, Dr. Roberts began, his voice deep and resonant. For those of you who believe this subject is beyond you, I suggest you take a seat and prepare for failure. This is not for the faint of heart. A few nervous glances exchanged across the room were enough to signal that Dr. Roberts's words had struck their mark. The students knew the stakes. Here, in his classroom, failure didn't mean just bad grades. It meant being humiliated in front of their peers, possibly having their future prospects questioned. The students didn't just fear Dr. Roberts, they feared what he represented, the unyielding authority of intellect and power. They knew he was a genius in his own right, a man who had solved problems that others couldn't even begin to approach. But they also knew that he saw their weaknesses before they had a chance to acknowledge them. And then there was Lucas Cruz. Sitting at the back of the room, Lucas seemed like just another quiet, unassuming student. He was a Filipino boy, small in stature, with dark hair neatly combed to the side, wearing a simple hoodie and faded jeans. His brown eyes were locked on his notebook, his hands moving with precise care as he jotted down the professor's notes. He didn't engage much with his classmates, nor did he feel the need to. Lucas had a quiet presence, one that didn't demand attention, but his silence was not a sign of weakness. It was his shield. Most students had heard of him, but few knew much about him. They whispered about his perfect attendance, his impressive test scores, but no one had ever really seen him. Lucas didn't socialize much. He didn't join the study groups or hang out with the others after class. His focus was singular, math. His mind moved at a speed that few could follow, unraveling the mysteries of calculus and algebra with an ease that could only be described as genius. But that genius, that quiet brilliance, often went unnoticed. No one suspected what was about to unfold. Lucas had arrived at Princeton on a scholarship. His family had barely enough to get by, and though his mother worked tirelessly as a nurse and his father taught high school in their hometown in the Philippines, they made it clear to Lucas that he needed to make the most of his opportunities. The pressure to succeed had been relentless. He was far from home, carrying the weight of his family's dreams on his shoulders. But he hadn't come to Princeton to prove anything to anyone except himself. He had always been different from the other students in the class. While many of his peers struggled with the intricacies of calculus, Lucas had an innate ability to grasp even the most complex theories. With startling clarity, numbers and symbols were his language. To him, equations were patterns waiting to be solved, puzzles waiting to be unlocked. It wasn't that Lucas didn't struggle, he did. But when he encountered a challenge, he didn't back down. Instead, he absorbed the lessons, turning them into tools that would help him solve even bigger problems. But today, he wasn't prepared for what was coming. Dr. Roberts had just introduced the topic of multivariable calculus, a subject that required an understanding of not just basic integration, but also advanced concepts of derivatives and partial fractions. It was a daunting subject, even for the most experienced students. But for Dr. Roberts, it was just another opportunity to prove who was worthy of his approval. And now, Dr. Roberts said, his voice carrying the weight of a challenge, "I'm going to present a problem to you. I'll give you 5 minutes to solve it. If anyone can even attempt to answer this, I'll be impressed." Lucas's pen hovered over his notebook, his mind already calculating the various ways to approach the problem that had just been written on the board. It wasn't a complicated equation, not for him at least. It was challenging, yes, but Lucas could already see the path forward. The others were still scribbling down the basic steps, trying to catch up with the professor's rapid-fire delivery. But Lucas was far ahead, seeing solutions that hadn't yet occurred to anyone else. As the minutes ticked away, Dr. Roberts paced in front of the room, his sharp eyes scanning his students, looking for signs of struggle. He was waiting for someone to raise their hand, to ask for help, something that would allow him to publicly dismantle them. He wasn't disappointed. Several students fidgeted nervously, exchanging glances. The clock continued its march forward, and soon the room was filled with the sound of rustling papers. "Anyone?" Dr. Roberts asked, his voice clipped. "Has anyone even attempted it? Or are we all wasting our time here?" The students stayed silent, their pens frozen above their papers. They knew what this meant. An attempt to solve the problem was a bold move, but to fail would be even worse. Lucas's hand rose, slow but deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife. Dr. Roberts's eyes snapped to him, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face before it was masked by a thin smirk. "You think you've got it, Cruz?" Lucas's calm gaze never wavered as he met the professor's eyes. "I believe I do, Professor Roberts." The students in the room exchanged uncertain glances, but no one spoke. They had never heard Lucas speak out of turn. It was as if they had forgotten he was even there. But now they were seeing him, and the moment was about to change everything. Dr. Roberts nodded, his tone shifting from mockery to genuine challenge. "All right then, show us. Show us that you can do what the others couldn't." Lucas stood up, the room holding its collective breath. Every movement he made was deliberate. He walked to the front of the classroom, taking the chalk from Dr. Roberts's hand with a calm that seemed to unsettle the professor. As Lucas began writing, his pen dancing across the board, the students couldn't help but stare. He was solving the problem not with haste, but with precision. Every stroke of the chalk felt like it was part of a larger design, a plan they couldn't yet see. The room was silent, each second stretching long, as if the world itself was waiting for the next move. Dr. Roberts stood with his arms crossed, watching, his expression unreadable. He was trying to maintain control, trying to hold on to the power that had always been his. But with each line Lucas wrote, something inside him shifted. The problem was slipping from his grasp, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. Lucas's hand moved faster now, almost effortlessly. The students around him began to whisper, disbelief creeping into their voices. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. How could he solve it so quickly? And more importantly, why had they all assumed he couldn't? As Lucas reached the final steps, he paused for a moment. He looked up at Dr. Roberts, his face betraying no emotion. "The solution is here," Lucas said quietly. his voice steady. The room fell into an eerie silence, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Dr. Roberts's eyes darted over the board, his fingers twitching, his pride and arrogance battling with the undeniable truth before him. What had just happened, and what would happen next? The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the otherwise silent lecture hall. Dr. Michael Roberts stood at the front of the class, his back straight, his demeanor a study in power. He knew the effect he had on his students, his reputation as an intellectual. Titan was unmatched, and to him there was no place for weakness in his classroom. The students were either with him, challenging themselves to meet his high standards, or they were not worthy of his time. He glanced at the board where he had written an intricate calculus problem, one that was known to send even the brightest students into a frenzy. It was a multivariable problem with nonlinear transformations, a beast of an equation that had stumped even some of the graduate students at the university. To Dr. Roberts, it was just another piece of work, a tool for sifting through the mediocre and the exceptional. He turned his attention to the students, his gaze sweeping across the room with a sense of casual disdain. They were all scribbling down notes, pretending to understand the problem. A few glances were exchanged, nervous, unsure looks. The atmosphere was thick with fear. Dr. Roberts thrived in this kind of environment. It was what he wanted. Control, authority, and the knowledge that he could break anyone who wasn't up to his standards. "Class," Dr. Roberts said, his voice smooth, laced with that familiar arrogance. "You've all read the problem. It's simple for those of you who know what you're doing." His eyes flicked over the room. "But I suspect that none of you have the intellectual stamina to even attempt it. I'm curious to see if anyone even dares to try." The students shuffled uncomfortably in their seats, some too afraid to make a move. No one spoke up. The fear of failure, of being exposed, was all-encompassing. In the back corner of the room, Lucas Cruz sat as he always did. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, focused entirely on the problem on the board. Lucas was a quiet student, the kind that people often overlooked. His classmates rarely noticed him, and he preferred it that way. He wasn't here to make friends or draw attention to himself. He was here to learn. Lucas had always been different. A Filipino student from a modest background, he had fought tooth and nail to make it to this prestigious university. His parents had sacrificed everything to send him here, and he carried the weight of their hopes on his shoulders. But the pressure didn't break him, it sharpened him. Lucas had a mind that worked faster than most people could comprehend. He had an ability to see the world through equations, to unravel complex systems with ease. But he wasn't one to boast about it. He didn't need to. His results spoke for themselves. His classmates didn't understand him, but they didn't have to. What they didn't know was that, while they were frantically scribbling down formulas in a desperate attempt to solve the problem, Lucas had already mapped out the entire solution in his mind. He knew what the answer was before Dr. Roberts had even finished explaining the problem, but he wasn't about to make it obvious. Not yet. Dr. Roberts's voice broke into his thoughts. "I'm sure none of you will solve this in time, but I'd like to see at least one of you try. Come on, don't be shy." He glanced toward the back of the room, his eyes landing on Lucas. There was no mistaking the challenge in his voice. Lucas felt the weight of Dr. Roberts's gaze, but he didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He simply watched. The problem on the board, his pen hovering above his notebook. The others in the room, too terrified to move, were frozen. The silence stretched on. "Mr. Cruz," Dr. Roberts said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've been awfully quiet. Care to give it a shot, or are you going to sit there and do nothing like the rest of them?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Roberts's challenge was clear. This was his moment to expose the students who weren't worthy of his class. The unspoken message was simple: fail, and you'll be exposed for the fraud you are. The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had heard the rumors about Lucas, the quiet Filipino kid who never seemed to struggle with math, but no one ever expected him to speak up. They thought him shy, maybe even insecure, a kid who didn't fit the mold of the typical Princeton student. But here he was, now the center of attention. Lucas's hand rose slowly, but there was no hesitation. In his movements, his fingers were steady, his grip firm. He wasn't nervous, he was simply calculating. Dr. Roberts's eyes widened ever so slightly, a flicker of surprise flashing across his face before it was masked by his usual smugness. "Well, Mr. Cruz," he said, his tone thick with sarcasm, "I'd be delighted to see you try. Let's see if your brilliance can match the standards of this class." Lucas stood, walking slowly to the front of the room. His steps were measured, deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. As he approached the board, the room seemed to get quieter, the students now watching intently. Every eye was on him, waiting for him to fail. They didn't know that Lucas had already solved the problem. They didn't know that for him, this was just another opportunity to demonstrate something far bigger than his mathematical abilities. This was about the facade of authority and the cracks that appeared when it was challenged. Dr. Roberts stood off to the side, his arms crossed, watching with a barely contained smirk. "Go ahead, Mr. Cruz," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Impress us." Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he took the chalk from Dr. Roberts's hand, his fingers brushing against the professor's, and turned to the board. The silence was deafening. He began writing, the chalk moving. Across the board with swift, precise strokes. The students leaned forward, some squinting to catch a glimpse of the magic unfolding before them. What they saw wasn't a frantic attempt to solve an unsolvable problem. It was calm, methodical, a mind at work that seemed to be several steps ahead of everyone else. Lucas wrote a few lines and then paused as if to check his work. Dr. Roberts's smirk faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Lucas had only just begun, and yet everything on the board seemed right. A few students in the front row glanced at each other. One whispered, "How is he doing that so quickly?" Lucas continued, his movements steady, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. He wasn't just solving the problem. He was simplifying it, breaking it down into pieces that everyone else could understand, if they only knew how to look at it. Dr. Roberts's expression shifted. He couldn't deny that Lucas was onto something, but that only made him more determined. His pride, his authority was at stake. "Mr. Cruz," he said, his voice sharp, "are you sure about that step? It looks too simple." Lucas looked up, meeting Dr. Roberts's gaze without a flicker of emotion. "Yes, Professor, this is the most efficient approach." Dr. Roberts's eyes tightened, and a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. He had underestimated this student, but he refused to show it. "Well then, let's see if you can finish it," he said, his voice dripping with challenge. The tension in the room was thick now. The students were no longer watching in disbelief. They were watching with awe. Lucas had caught them off guard, and they had no idea how to react. They had expected him to fail, to crumble under the pressure. Instead, he was proving everyone wrong. The clock on the wall continued to tick, but in that moment, time seemed to slow. Every stroke of Lucas's chalk felt like it was setting something in motion, something that couldn't be undone. Dr. Roberts stood there, frozen, as Lucas continued to write. The equation, once an insurmountable beast, was now becoming something that the entire room could understand. It wasn't just that Lucas had solved it, he had made it look easy. The room was silent, waiting for the inevitable fallout. But as Lucas reached the final steps of the problem, he paused, glanced at Dr. Roberts, and then turned back to the board. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Done," Lucas said, his voice steady. The room was still. The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Dr. Roberts didn't speak at first. He stood there, his mouth slightly open, eyes scanning the board. What had just happened? How had this student, who he had so thoroughly underestimated, solved a problem that was supposed to break him? And then, for the first time in a long time, Dr. Roberts felt something he rarely experienced: doubt. The silence in the lecture hall was deafening. Dr. Roberts stood with his arms crossed, watching intently as Lucas Cruz approached the chalkboard. The students, all seemingly holding their breath, couldn't look away. Every eye was fixed on the unassuming Filipino student who had just defied the professor's challenge. For the first time in the lecture, there was no rustling of notebooks or the tap of pens on paper. All that remained was the steady rise and fall of Lucas's breath, the soft squeak of the chalk as it met the board, and the growing hum of anticipation. From the students who now understood, something unexpected was happening. Lucas didn't rush. His movements were deliberate, almost measured. He wasn't like the others, who scrambled in panic or in desperate hope that someone else would figure it out. No, Lucas had always been different. His mind, as sharp as a razor, didn't scramble. It cut through the confusion with ease. As he glanced at the problem, his mind immediately went into overdrive. Multivariable calculus. It was complex, no doubt. But for Lucas, it was like a puzzle waiting to be solved. He didn't need to write down every calculation. He already knew where the numbers would go. The solution was unfolding in his mind with flawless precision, like a symphony, each step flowing seamlessly into the next. Yet despite his calm, there was an undeniable weight pressing down on him. He could feel it, the room's expectations, the tension in the air, the suffocating silence. It was as though the entire class was watching him for something to go wrong. They were waiting for him to fail. Dr. Roberts, his voice cool and dismissive, broke the silence with a pointed comment. "You're moving a bit slowly, Mr. Cruz. You're not one of the slow students in this class, are you?" He didn't shout, didn't raise his voice. His words were sharp, almost like daggers coated in honey. He was hoping to rattle Lucas, to make him question himself, to make him second-guess his every move. But Lucas didn't flinch, not even a twitch. The chalk in his hand moved slowly, but purposefully. Each line he drew on the board felt deliberate, intentional. The equation that once seemed daunting to most of his peers was now unfolding piece by piece before their eyes. There was no hesitation in his movements. The students at the front leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of what Lucas was doing. A few of them whispered under their breath, exchanging confused glances. How was he doing this so effortlessly? It was supposed to be impossible, something only the truly gifted could tackle. But here was Lucas, solving it with the calm precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. In the back row, a student named Aaron, who had been one of the more vocal critics of Lucas's quiet demeanor, leaned over to his friend. This can't be happening, right? He's just solving it like it's nothing." His voice was low, laced with disbelief. "I don't know," his friend replied, his voice trembling. "It looks like he knows what he's doing." Dr. Roberts was watching now, his arms no longer crossed, but hanging by his sides, his fingers twitching nervously. The certainty with which Lucas was solving the problem was starting to unnerve him. His initial confidence had begun to falter. He wouldn't allow this student to outshine him, not in his own classroom. The professor stepped forward, positioning himself behind Lucas. "I must say, Mr. Cruz," he began, his voice louder now, dripping with feigned politeness, "I'm quite impressed. But solving this problem, it's not about your ability to do it quickly, it's about understanding the concept. And I can't help but wonder, do you really understand the concept?" Lucas paused for a brief moment, but only to steady his hand, ensuring that every movement was precise. He didn't let the professor's words break his concentration. In fact, he could almost feel the tension in Dr. Roberts's words. The professor was rattled. He was trying to undermine Lucas, to cast doubt on his abilities in front of the class. Lucas looked up for the first time, meeting Dr. Roberts's eyes. "I understand the concept," he said quietly, his voice calm, unwavering. "I understand exactly how it works, and that's why the solution is so simple." The room fell deathly silent. No one dared to move, not even Dr. Roberts, whose jaw tightened imperceptibly at Lucas's confidence. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was making it look too easy. It was as if Lucas were mocking the complexity of the very thing that had stumped the class for hours. The students were all watching him now, their eyes wide. Some had started to whisper, unsure of what they were witnessing. Was this real? Was Lucas really solving the equation? Could it be that simple? Dr. Roberts, unwilling to be outdone, crossed the room quickly, snatching the chalk from Lucas's hand. Let's see how you really solve this then. If you truly understand the concept, let's see you explain it. His voice was tight, though, and there was a slight tremble in his fingers as he wrote the next step on the board. His movements far less fluid than Lucas's had been. Lucas didn't hesitate. The coefficient was applied incorrectly. He said matter-of-factly, "You carried it outside too early, which distorts the limits of integration," the students murmured, looking at each other in confusion. The room was filled with a quiet sense of disbelief. Some were impressed. Others were still too stunned to process the sheer boldness of Lucas's calm certainty. Dr. Roberts, caught in the moment, glared at the board, quickly scanning over the work Lucas had corrected. The professor's mind raced, frantically trying to find an error, a flaw, something that would prove Lucas wrong. But he couldn't find anything. Every line of the equation was perfect. Every correction was precise. "No, Mr. Cruz," Dr. Roberts muttered, his voice now strained. "You've made a mistake. There's no way you could have solved this so easily." His tone wasn't as confident anymore. It wasn't the tone of someone in control. It was the tone of someone who was desperately trying to maintain their authority. "This isn't a simple problem. It's quite simple," Lucas interrupted softly, cutting through Dr. Roberts's words with the calmest of tones. "If you follow the correct steps, it's simple." The room seemed to go still as Dr. Roberts struggled to process the implications of what had just transpired. How could this student, this quiet, reserved kid, have done what none of the others could? How could Lucas, who had barely spoken a word all semester, have solved the equation so easily while the others were still stuck in confusion? A few students glanced at each other, the disbelief giving way to a creeping sense of admiration. Was Lucas really as smart as he seemed? Or was there something more to him, something that no one had noticed before? Dr. Roberts took a step back, his mind racing. His eyes darted across the equation on the board, desperately searching for the smallest mistake, but there was nothing. He had been beaten, and he couldn't bear it. He glanced back at the class, his voice now shaky. "Well, I suppose we'll just move on, then," he said, trying to regain his composure, but his words were hollow. The class had already seen the truth. Lucas didn't respond. He simply stepped back, handing the chalk to Dr. Roberts. He had said what needed to be said with his actions. The room was still in stunned silence, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. The students had seen something they weren't prepared for, someone who wasn't afraid of the system, someone who had the courage to defy authority and to win. As Lucas walked back to his seat, the eyes of the room followed him, some with awe, others with resentment. But one thing was clear. Nothing in this class would ever be the same again. Dr. Roberts, standing in front of the board, was lost in thought, his grip tightening on the chalk. He was no longer the one in control. He was just another professor who had been bested by a student, and that realization stung more than any failure ever could. The room remained silent, the pressure thick in the air. What would happen next? Could Dr. Roberts recover from this? Would the students remember Lucas as the student who defied the odds, or was there more to come? The answer, unknown to all, was waiting just around the corner. The chalk in Lucas's hand felt weightless as it glided across the board. He wasn't just solving the equation, he was reimagining it, finding a way to untangle the complex mess of numbers and symbols Dr. Roberts had presented with ease. As the professor stood just behind him, arms crossed in an attempt to maintain authority, Lucas felt a wave of pressure. But it wasn't the professor he had to worry about now. It was the room, the eyes of every student fixed on him. The weight of their expectations pressed heavily on his shoulders. Could he maintain this calm? Could he truly solve this in front of them all? He didn't look back. Instead, his eyes remained locked on the equation, each step coming naturally. To him, like a familiar song, Lucas knew these problems. They were his comfort zone, his playground. As he wrote, he began explaining softly, almost as an afterthought, though every word was deliberate, meant to inform rather than to boast. "The mistake lies in how the limits were applied," Lucas began, his voice steady. "By carrying the coefficient outside too early, the equation loses its balance. The limits of the integral are distorted, changing the entire problem." A few students at the front leaned forward, their pens halting in mid-motion. They exchanged glances, as if questioning whether they had misheard. Was this quiet kid, who barely spoke in class, actually explaining the problem? And more shockingly, was he right? Dr. Roberts shifted his weight, uncomfortable. This wasn't going as he had planned. He'd expected to see Lucas struggle, to stumble over something, anything, that would reveal his inadequacy. But so far, the kid was making it look easy. Too easy. "What makes you so sure, Mr. Cruz?" Dr. Roberts's voice broke through the growing silence, a challenge to Lucas's. "Calm. You believe you understand the concept that I laid out on the board. Then explain how your solution will match the result we're aiming for." Lucas didn't respond with words. Instead, he wrote another step on the board. With each stroke of the chalk, the class became more transfixed by what was happening in front of them. They hadn't expected this. Nobody had. The students' initial skepticism turned to curiosity. Some even began to whisper to each other. "Did you hear that?" one whispered. "He's explaining it perfectly. I didn't even think he knew how to explain this," another muttered. Lucas paused only momentarily to absorb the information that his mind was processing with unnerving precision. He didn't have to stop and double-check like the others. His mind was already a few steps ahead, waiting for the next breakthrough to present itself. He continued, calm as ever. "Once you fix the error in the coefficient, everything aligns. The solution comes out clean. It's just a matter of following the structure step by step." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The students were no longer just passive observers. They were now active participants in a revelation that was unfolding before their very eyes. Some students still hadn't fully grasped the elegance of what was happening, but others were beginning to realize something. This wasn't just about math. This was about something far bigger. This was about who Lucas was and why they'd all been blind to his brilliance. Dr. Roberts, for the first time, felt a flicker of doubt. It wasn't in his ability as a teacher. No, that was too deep-rooted to question. But something about Lucas was making him uneasy. The professor watched the chalk moving across the board, trying to catch a mistake, anything to prove that this student wasn't that good. But there was nothing but an elegant solution unfolding before him. "Let me make sure I understand," Dr. Roberts said, attempting to maintain control of the room. "So, you're claiming that I missed a simple step? A minor error caused this entire equation to be wrong?" Lucas looked up briefly, his gaze meeting the professor's. "I'm not claiming anything, Professor. I'm simply correcting the error." The tension in the room deepened. The students were starting to feel it. The divide between the power Dr. Roberts once wielded effortlessly and the quiet defiance Lucas had brought to the table. This was more than a simple correction. This was a challenge to authority, an intellectual confrontation that no one had seen coming. One student in the back row, Rachel, leaned over to her friend. "Is this for real? He's correcting." "Dr. Roberts." Her friend Peter nodded slowly, his eyes wide. "This kid is a genius, and Dr. Roberts doesn't know what to do." Lucas didn't break eye contact with Dr. Roberts as he continued solving the equation. The professor's discomfort was growing, but it wasn't enough for him to back down. He had spent years building this reputation, this empire of intellect only. To have it questioned by a student who had barely spoken a word all semester, he refused to let this happen. "Well then, Mr. Cruz," Dr. Roberts said, his voice clipped, "let's see how well you do when we throw in something more challenging." He quickly scribbled another line on the board, adding a more complicated integral to the equation. "This should test your skills, don't you think?" Lucas barely blinked. Without missing a beat, he took the chalk, stepping into the challenge. Dr. Roberts had laid out before him The new addition to the equation was indeed more complex, but to Lucas, it wasn't a roadblock. It was just another step in a puzzle that was waiting to be solved. His hand moved swiftly, confidently, as he began to explain the solution once more, his voice quiet but assured. The trick with this step is to use the transformation on the right term first. It will balance the equation, simplifying the rest. Of the process, Lucas explained, outlining the solution. His pace was steady, each stroke bringing him closer to the solution. Once that's done, the remaining terms fall into place. The students were now on the edge of their seats. They watched as Lucas continued to break down the problem piece by piece, explaining each detail with perfect clarity. He wasn't just solving math problems, he was deconstructing the very idea that had been built around Dr. Roberts's infallibility. And with every step, the walls around the professor seemed to grow thinner. The whispers in the room had grown louder, but not just of confusion now. There was awe in them. These were the students who had once feared Dr. Roberts's power, the ones who believed that only the elite few could truly grasp the depths of mathematics. But Lucas wasn't one of them, was he? He was just another quiet student in the back corner, and yet here he was, dismantling an equation that had sent their best minds scrambling. Was it luck, or was it something far greater? By the time Lucas set down the chalk, the class was no longer questioning his skill. They were questioning everything they had assumed about their professor. They were no longer the same students they had been before that moment. Dr. Roberts's authority, his seemingly unassailable grasp on the class, was now in question, but the professor didn't speak. He simply stared at the board, his mind spinning, the silence stretched, the weight of the room's gaze pressing on him. Lucas's voice broke the stillness. "Would you like me to explain the steps again, Professor, or shall I move on, Doctor?" Roberts didn't answer immediately. His jaw clenched. For the first time, he had been put in his place, not just by a student, but by someone he had underestimated. A chill ran down his spine, the realization settling in that this wasn't a battle he could easily win. But what came next? Would Lucas's brilliance be enough to undo the legacy of authority Dr. Roberts had spent years building? The room was suffocating with tension, thick like the heavy silence after a storm. The students' eyes were glued to Lucas Cruz, who stood confidently at the chalkboard. Every student knew the stakes now. What had begun as a mockery of a seemingly weak student was quickly turning into an intellectual showdown. But Dr. Roberts wasn't the type to concede defeat easily. No, he had built his entire career on being the authority, the master of the subject. This young student, no matter how brilliant, would not undo that legacy in front of the entire class. Dr. Roberts's gaze narrowed as he stared at the perfect solution Lucas had just written on the board. He had been sure there would be a mistake somewhere, a flaw he could point out to salvage his authority, but there was none. Lucas had unraveled the equation with the kind of precision and clarity that most students would never achieve in a lifetime. But Dr. Roberts couldn't allow himself to be outshone by a student, especially not one who had barely spoken a word all semester. The students were watching him now, waiting for his next move. The room was alive with anticipation, the murmurs spreading like wildfire. With a sharp breath, Dr. Roberts pushed forward, stepping up to the front of the room. His voice, when it came, was cold and calculated, almost dismissive. "Impressive," he said, his eyes still locked on Lucas, "but not nearly enough to make up for what's missing. Let's see how you handle this." The professor turned to the board and with deliberate precision began scribbling a new, far more complicated equation. It was an advanced problem, one that even graduate students would struggle with. It involved intricate derivatives and multidimensional integrals, a true test of anyone's understanding of calculus. The problem was meant to overwhelm, to make Lucas falter. Dr. Roberts knew it, the students knew it. But would Lucas? "There," Dr. Roberts said, stepping back with an air of finality. "Let's see if you're truly as brilliant as you think. Mr. Cruz, Solve this, and I'll consider it an honest attempt. Fail, and maybe we'll all have learned something about the limitations of confidence." The challenge hung in the air like an open invitation to failure. Every student in the room could feel the gravity of the moment. If Lucas couldn't solve this new problem, it would silence the awe and disbelief that had begun to spread through. The class, Dr. Roberts's authority, would remain intact, and Lucas would be just another student, swallowed up by the system he was supposed to belong to. But Lucas remained unfazed. His expression was calm, his gaze unwavering. The equation before him was more complex, yes, but it wasn't an insurmountable challenge. Lucas wasn't concerned with Dr. Roberts's attempt to humiliate him. He was focused on one thing, the problem. It wasn't about proving himself anymore. It was about finding the solution, understanding the underlying patterns, and making sense of the chaos that lay on the board. Without a word, Lucas took the chalk again. The room held its breath as he moved with calculated precision, erasing the first part of the equation and starting again from scratch. Every student watched, some with trepidation, others with curiosity, as Lucas began to solve the problem. The chalk moved like an extension of his mind, each stroke adding a new layer of clarity to the equation. Dr. Roberts stood behind him, arms crossed, watching closely. He was ready to pounce the moment Lucas made a mistake. But Lucas's movements were deliberate, slow but steady. He wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply solving the problem. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room mounted. Dr. Roberts's smug expression faltered as he began to realize something. Lucas wasn't struggling. He wasn't second-guessing himself or looking for shortcuts. He was calmly walking through the problem step by step, as though it were just another equation in a long line of equations he had solved before. The students were in shock. Many of them were holding their breath, watching in disbelief as Lucas moved through the problem with an ease that defied their understanding. How was he doing this? This was the kind of problem that even the best math students at Princeton would need hours to complete. "You're moving too quickly," Dr. Roberts snapped, unable to mask the frustration in his voice. "Take your time, Mr. Cruz. This is not a race." Lucas glanced over his shoulder briefly, his eyes meeting Dr. Roberts's. There was no anger in his gaze, no defiance, only calm. He returned to the board without a word. His mind was so far ahead, it didn't matter what the professor said. He had already solved the first part of the equation in his mind, and the rest was just a formality. As Lucas continued, the rest of the class was now fully absorbed in his movements. The murmurs had stopped completely. No one dared speak now. They were watching a student defy everything they had come to believe about success, about intelligence, about what was possible in the classroom. And with every stroke of the chalk, Lucas was shifting the balance of power. Dr. Roberts clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening into fists. He could feel the eyes of the class on him, their expectation building. He had to stop this. He had to break Lucas before the entire class saw the truth, that this quiet student was more than capable, more than worthy of being there. And then it happened. With one final, precise stroke, Lucas underlined the last term of the equation. He turned around, facing the class and Dr. Roberts with an unwavering calm. "Done," he said simply. The room fell dead silent. Dr. Roberts stared at the board, his eyes scanning the steps Lucas had taken, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't find a mistake. There was no flaw, no error in Lucas's work. The equation which had seemed insurmountable was now completely solved, cleanly and elegantly. Dr. Roberts opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way to discredit Lucas's solution. But there was nothing, no mistake, no trick, no way to prove that this student, this quiet, unassuming Filipino kid, hadn't just outclassed him. The class sat in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Finally, one of the students from the back row whispered, "He really did it." Another student added, almost in awe, "Dr. Roberts, he's been bested." Dr. Roberts's face flushed, a mixture of disbelief and anger rising in his chest. His hand, still holding the chalk, trembled slightly. He wanted to say something, to restore his authority, but nothing would come. The room had already made up its mind. Lucas had not just solved the problem, he had shattered the illusion Dr. Roberts had carefully crafted for years. Impressive, Dr. Roberts finally muttered, though the words felt hollow, empty. His voice was strained, not just by the defeat, but by the realization that he had underestimated Lucas in a way he never should have. Lucas didn't respond. He didn't need to. The work on the board spoke for itself. He stepped away, calmly, returning to his seat, leaving the entire room behind in stunned silence. The students exchanged looks, their disbelief giving way to a new understanding. This wasn't about math anymore. It was about something far more profound, a quiet victory over arrogance, a triumph of intellect and willpower against the system that sought to keep people like Lucas in the background. The class had changed, and Lucas Cruz had just taken the first step in changing their world forever. The entire room was still. The weight of Lucas Cruz's solution hung in the air like an unexpected storm. The tension, which had been building ever since Dr. Roberts presented the problem, was now palpable. Students were leaning forward, unable to look away, as if they were witnessing something monumental unfold in front of them. Lucas had done the impossible. He had taken a problem that had stumped every student in the class and solved it, not with frantic desperation, but with the same calm precision that marked his every move. And yet, as the room fell into stunned silence, Dr. Roberts stood there, his face slowly turning a shade darker with each passing second. His pride was crumbling. How could this quiet, unassuming student have outsmarted him? How had Lucas, who had barely spoken a word all semester, managed to solve a problem that even graduate students would have struggled with? Dr. Roberts's hand clenched into a fist, and his voice, when it finally came, was tight with frustration. "Well, Mr. Cruz," he said, his words sharp, "you've certainly managed to solve the problem this time, but I'm sure this was nothing more than a fluke, a lucky guess." The challenge was clear. Dr. Roberts was unwilling to accept the possibility that Lucas was genuinely more capable than he had given him credit for. The professor's authority was being questioned, and he would not stand for it. Lucas didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. The professor's attempt at undermining him was nothing more than a reflection of his own insecurities. But Lucas had no time for this petty back and forth. He was here to solve problems, not engage in the ego, battles of those too afraid to acknowledge brilliance when it presented itself. Dr. Roberts continued, his voice rising with each word. "You think you can just stroll in here, solve one problem, and suddenly be the star of the class?" He let out a bitter laugh, his eyes scanning the room, daring any of the students to back him up. "You think you know more than everyone else in this room? You think you're smarter than me?" Lucas slowly turned to face him. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. No one spoke. Everyone knew what was happening. This wasn't about math anymore. It was a battle of egos. It was Dr. Roberts's fragile authority fighting against a student who wasn't willing to let his brilliance be drowned by arrogance. Lucas didn't respond with anger or frustration. Instead, he met Dr. Roberts's gaze with calm, unshakable confidence. "No, Professor," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. "I don't think I'm smarter than you. But I do think I'm capable of understanding the material, perhaps more than you give me credit for." The class was stunned into silence. No one had expected such a quiet student to speak with such conviction, let alone challenge Dr. Roberts directly. The professor's eyes flickered momentarily, unsure whether to respond with further confrontation or back down. For a brief moment, the power shifted. The class could feel it. Like the earth beneath their feet had shifted, tilting ever so slightly. The authority that Dr. Roberts had held for so long was no longer as solid as it once seemed. But Dr. Roberts wasn't one to let his control slip that easily. "You're quite bold, Mr. Cruz," he spat, his voice dripping with condescension. "But let's see how you handle this." Without warning, he wrote another equation on the board, a far more complex one, filled with intricate derivatives and multidimensional integrals, a problem meant to stump anyone who dared challenge. "Indeed, this," Dr. Roberts said, his voice laced with arrogance, "is a real challenge. Solve it and I'll be impressed. Fail, and maybe I'll start to think your genius is just a fluke." The class watched, the weight of the challenge hanging over them like a ticking clock. Lucas had already shown his brilliance once, but this problem was designed to crush any hope of further defiance. It was a trap, one that Dr. Roberts hoped Lucas would walk right into. But Lucas, ever the picture of calm, didn't hesitate. Lucas walked up to the board once more, his steps steady and deliberate. Dr. Roberts's eyes tracked him, waiting for the moment he would falter, waiting for Lucas to make a mistake, anything that would prove him right, that this student wasn't worthy of the attention he was getting. The room was so silent, the tension so thick, that the only sound that could be heard was the scratching of chalk as Lucas began to solve the equation. The students exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what would happen next. Would Lucas be able to do it again, or was this problem truly beyond even his genius, the one that would break him? But Lucas's movements were fluid, precise. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was dismantling it, breaking it down into its smallest components with a clarity that few could comprehend. The equation, which had looked like an insurmountable wall moments ago, was now being torn apart, piece by piece, before their very eyes. As the minutes ticked by, the students leaned forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on Lucas. They had seen him solve the first problem with ease. But this was something else. Was it possible that he could truly pull this off again? Dr. Roberts's composure was cracking. His fingers twitched with nervous energy as Lucas continued to work through the equation. He glanced at the students, who were no longer whispering or doubting. They were watching in awe, waiting for something, anything, that would explain what they were seeing. The professor couldn't bear it any longer. "Mr. Cruz," he snapped, his voice sharp, "are you really telling me that this is your solution? You think you've solved it the right way? Don't you see? You've missed a crucial step, a step that anyone with real understanding would have known." Lucas paused, his chalk hovering above the board. He didn't speak for a moment, his gaze turning toward Dr. Roberts. The professor's words were harsh, filled with the weight of someone who was desperately trying to hold on to the one thing that made him feel powerful, his authority. But Lucas wasn't shaken, not this time. "Actually, Professor," Lucas said quietly, his voice still unwavering, "I didn't miss anything. If you look closely, the step you're referring to was unnecessary. The solution works without it." The room was dead silent. Dr. Roberts stared at Lucas, his mouth opening and closing, trying to formulate a response. His mind was racing, searching for something, anything, that could disprove what Lucas had just said. But there was nothing. The equation was correct. The solution was flawless. Dr. Roberts, for the first time, felt the sting of humiliation. It was a bitter, suffocating feeling. His pride, which had been so firmly built over the years, was now crumbling in front of him, shattered by a student who had done nothing more than understand the material in a way Dr. Roberts had never considered. He tried to recover, but the damage was done. His voice wavered, the control slipping further from his grasp. "Fine," he muttered, his gaze hardening. "You've solved it. But don't think this is over, Mr. Cruz." Lucas didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was a quiet victory in itself, the ultimate rebuttal to the professor who had tried so hard to bring him down. He returned to his seat, his mind already moving on to the next problem, the next challenge. But the students? They were still in shock. The room had shifted. The balance of power had changed, and as Lucas sat quietly, his calmness only made the storm inside Dr. Roberts more evident. The class was no longer just a place of learning. It had become a battlefield, and Lucas Cruz had just won. The students, some still in awe, began to exchange glances. They knew something had changed. They didn't yet know what it meant, but they understood one thing clearly. Lucas wasn't just another student in the class. He was something much more. And Dr. Roberts's authority? It was no longer as absolute as it had once seemed. What would happen next? Could Dr. Roberts recover from this defeat? Or had Lucas's brilliance shifted the very foundation of the class? Forever? The answer lingered in the air, unanswered, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The silence in the lecture hall was suffocating, thick with unspoken words and the weight of what had just transpired. Lucas Cruz stood at the front of the room, his hand still gripping the chalk that had solved not one, but two complex problems. In front of a class full of students and a professor who had tried to humiliate him, he stood there, not with arrogance, but with an unshakable calm, the kind that came from knowing that, for once, the power had shifted in his favor. Behind him, Dr. Michael Roberts, the professor who had once ruled this classroom with an iron fist, was frozen. His eyes were trained on the board, the equations that Lucas had solved flawlessly. For a moment, his face was unreadable, a mask of rigid control, but underneath it all, the cracks were visible. The arrogant professor, the one who had tried to tear Lucas down, who had mocked him in front of everyone, was now struggling to retain his composure. Dr. Roberts had tried everything to make Lucas fail. The harsh words, the insidious challenges, the doubts he cast on the young student's abilities, but none of it worked. Instead, Lucas had done what no one expected. He had defied the professor and, in doing so, had shattered the unspoken hierarchy in that room. Dr. Roberts swallowed, his throat tight. His pride, built over decades of teaching and academic achievements, was in tatters. He opened his mouth, perhaps to say something, to regain control, but the words didn't come. There was nothing left for him to say. A few students exchanged glances, some in awe, others in disbelief. The shift in the room was palpable. Lucas had not only solved the equations, but he had also upended everything the students had believed about their own intellectual limitations, and about Dr. Roberts's unquestionable authority. "I guess that's all for today," Dr. Roberts muttered, his voice strained. He quickly wiped his hands on his pants, as if trying to rid himself of the very memory of Lucas's victory. He didn't look at the students. He didn't even look at Lucas. "You can all go." The students slowly started to gather their things, their whispers growing louder. It wasn't just that Lucas had solved the problems. It was how he had handled the entire situation. He had not once let Dr. Roberts's hostility rattle him. He had stood his ground, remained poised, and, in the end, had proven that brilliance could not be buried beneath arrogance. Lucas didn't say anything in return. He didn't need to. His actions spoke for themselves. He slowly turned away from the board, the last equation now underlined in neat, flawless strokes, and walked back to his seat with the same quiet confidence that had defined him throughout. The semester, his classmates watched him as he passed, some still processing the unexpected turn of events, others with admiration now written across their faces. The quiet student from the back of the room was no longer invisible to them. He had risen above their assumptions, above their judgments, and had done so with a quiet dignity that left them speechless. As Lucas sat down, his gaze briefly met Dr. Roberts's. For just a moment, their eyes locked. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. Lucas had not only solved the problem, he had exposed the cracks in the very foundation of Dr. Roberts's authority. Dr. Roberts turned away, his back rigid as he grabbed his bag, desperate to leave the room before anyone could say anything else. But Lucas didn't follow him with his eyes. His attention was focused on something else, the work he had done, the equation that had once seemed impossible now laid bare for everyone to see. And then something unexpected happened. A student from the front row, a tall young woman named Sarah, stood up and walked toward Lucas. The rest of the class fell silent, their eyes shifting to her, unsure of what she was about to do. Sarah stopped in front of Lucas's desk, her expression unreadable at first. She looked down at him for a moment before speaking, her voice soft but clear. "Lucas, that was incredible." Her words hung in the air, each one carrying the weight of the change she was beginning to see in him and in herself. Lucas blinked, his eyebrows slightly raised. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected any kind of recognition. For so long he had been the quiet observer, the one who kept to himself, never looking for validation or praise. But Sarah's words felt different. They were not just a compliment, they were a recognition of something deeper. She wasn't just acknowledging his intelligence, she was acknowledging his quiet strength, his ability to rise above the circumstances that had tried to define him. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. I don't know if you realize this, but you just did something that none of us thought was possible. You made us all look at things differently. You've taught me more than this class ever could. The room, which had once been filled with uncertainty and fear, now felt lighter. A new kind of respect was forming in the air, and it wasn't just for Lucas's mathematical abilities. It was for the courage it had taken to stand up, not just to Dr. Roberts, but to everyone who had ever underestimated him. Lucas looked up at Sarah, his face still as calm as ever, but inside, a quiet warmth began to spread. He wasn't used to being seen this way, but the recognition felt good, felt right. Thanks, he said, his voice steady but with a trace of emotion beneath it. I didn't do it for anyone but myself. Sarah smiled softly, nodding in understanding. I get it, but you've inspired us all. Don't forget that. The words hung in the air, settling into the hearts of the students around them. It was as if the walls between them had begun to crumble. No longer were they just students in a lecture hall. They were witnesses to something transformative. As Sarah returned to her seat, the rest of the class slowly began to murmur in agreement. Others stood, offering Lucas silent nods, small gestures of respect, of acknowledgement. The power had shifted, not just between Lucas and Dr. Roberts, but among the students themselves. They were no longer just passive observers of this academic theater. They were participants in a deeper shift that had occurred right before their eyes. Dr. Roberts, still attempting to regain some semblance of control, was now the one retreating. He quickly grabbed his bag and left the room without a word, his departure almost as abrupt as the challenge he had thrown at Lucas in the first place. The door slammed behind him, and for a moment the room felt strangely empty until the students turned to each other, exchanging looks that said everything. Lucas sat back in his chair, his mind still processing the events that had unfolded. He hadn't sought recognition, but it had found him in the most unexpected of ways. He wasn't the invisible student anymore. He was someone who had just turned the tables, not just on Dr. Roberts, but on all the expectations that had once been placed on him, and for the first time, Lucas felt like he truly belonged in this space. Not because of his intelligence alone, but because he had proven that his voice mattered, that he could stand up, rise above the judgments, and defy the very system that had tried to bury him. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but Lucas didn't move. He sat there for a moment, staring at the empty board in front of him. The silence now felt different, filled with possibility. He had won, not just a battle against a professor, but a battle for his own sense of worth. As the students filtered out of the room, Lucas finally stood up. He walked out into the hallway, his step just a little lighter, his chest a little fuller. The world outside was waiting, but for the first time, Lucas wasn't afraid of it. He had finally found his place, and no one, no professor, no judgment, no prejudice could ever take that from him again. The classroom buzzed with a quiet hum, the kind that followed a storm. The students shuffled out, exchanging glances, whispers slipping between them like shadows. Their eyes lingered on Lucas Cruz, who sat silently at his desk, still processing everything that had unfolded. The tension of the last hour had left the air thick, but now in the aftermath, it felt strangely empty. Lucas was used to being invisible, to blending into the background, to quietly doing what needed to be done without anyone noticing. But today, something had changed. He had been seen, not just as a student, but as someone capable, someone who had just turned the tables on a professor who thought he could be humiliated. Lucas exhaled slowly, his eyes still fixed on the front of the room. The equations were still fresh in his mind, the moments that had led up to his victory, like a sequence of images flashing by. But beyond the numbers, beyond the calm certainty, he'd felt in solving the problems, something deeper had shifted, a shift in himself, a shift in how he saw the world. Dr. Roberts's condescension had tried to break him, tried to force him to question his place in that classroom, his right to stand there. But Lucas had refused. For the first time in a long while, he had refused to let someone's narrow view of him define who he was or what he could do. As the last student exited, the door clicking softly behind them, Lucas remained seated. His hands rested on the desk in front of him, fingers grazing the edge of his notebook, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about Dr. Roberts or the battle they had just waged. He was thinking about the path that had led him here, to this moment, where he had been able to prove not just his intelligence but his resilience. Growing up in the Philippines, Lucas had never felt like he belonged. His family had sacrificed everything to send him to Princeton, a place that was meant for the best, for those who could navigate this world of privilege and opportunity. He had always known that he wasn't like the others, his accent, his heritage, his quiet nature. But in the classrooms of Princeton, he'd found a place where his mind could wander freely, where equations and numbers felt like the only language that truly understood him. But that language hadn't always been enough to shield him from the harsh realities of being an outsider. In every classroom, he had felt the weight of expectations, the silent assumptions about his intelligence, his background, and his worth. He'd never complained, never pushed back. He'd simply focused on his work, trying to blend into the background, hoping his results would speak louder than his presence. But today, in that moment, he realized that blending in had never been enough. It was time to make his presence known, not through arrogance or defiance, but through quiet confidence, through the unshakable belief that his mind, his abilities, were just as valid as anyone else's. He glanced at the clock. The class had ended nearly half an hour ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave yet. The thoughts continued to churn inside him, the weight of what had just happened settling over him like a blanket. He had stood up to Dr. Roberts, yes, but he had also stood up to the doubt and fear that had held him back for so long. And in doing so, he had carved out a space for himself that no one could take away. A small part of him still wondered if Dr. Roberts would ever acknowledge him as more than just a quiet student in the back row, but that no longer mattered. Lucas had learned something far more important today. He had learned to believe in himself, to trust his abilities, and to know that no matter how hard the world tried to knock him down, he would rise again, stronger. He stood up slowly, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. The door to the classroom was still ajar, a faint breeze drifting in from the hallway. He walked toward it, taking one last look at the room that had been both a battleground and a place of growth, a place where he had finally proven that he wasn't just a student who would quietly follow the rules, but someone who could challenge the system when necessary. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The world outside was still the same, quiet, sprawling, filled with possibilities. But Lucas knew now that he could face it head-on. He could walk into any room and own his space without fear or hesitation. The students who had witnessed his victory, the ones who had once overlooked him, would remember this moment. They would remember the quiet student who had defied the odds, who had shown them that intelligence didn't need to be loud to be powerful. And though Lucas didn't need their recognition, the knowledge that he had earned their respect felt like a quiet triumph in itself. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he walked down the hall. He pulled it out and saw a message from his mother. "I'm proud of you, son. Keep doing your best. We believe in you." Lucas smiled softly, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had done this for himself, yes, but also for his family, for the sacrifices they had made to give him this chance. They had believed in him when the world had made him feel invisible. and today he had proven that their belief was not misplaced. As he walked out of the building, the cool air of the late afternoon wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. The sky was tinged with orange, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. Lucas stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the quiet triumph, the peace that now settled over him. He wasn't just the student in the back of the room anymore. He was Lucas Cruz, someone who had defied the odds, someone who had proved that even in a world full of challenges and doubts, belief in oneself was the most powerful tool of all. And with that, Lucas walked forward into the world, ready for whatever came next, with the quiet confidence that only came from knowing he was finally where he belonged.